my name is Michael Windfuhr. I'm a political scientist, not a lawyer. I started to work on human rights by founding, after my university degree, an international human rights organization, Food First Information and Action Network, which was entirely working or is entirely working on the right to adequate food and water. And since then, I'm working with the issue of economic, social, and cultural rights. I was 20 years with that organization. I did a lot of lobby work in the UN, also using the committee I'm now a member of, presenting their parallel information from civil society organizations. We supported a lot of organizations from different parts of the world to deliver their own reports and that. And since 11 years now, or since 10 years, sorry, I'm now deputy director of the German Institute for Human Rights, which is the national human rights institution of Germany. And we collaborate also with a lot of other national human rights institutions. It's worldwide more than 120 which exist on human rights issues. And what is our role is promotion and protection of human rights in each of the institutions with a focus on its own land. Yeah. So after having worked for many decades on international issues, I'm now focusing also on, let's say, German politics, but also German politics abroad, the extraterritorial obligations of Germany. So on business and human rights and development aid and human rights, climate change policies and human rights. So this is also part of it. Yeah. And I'm since 2017 member of the UN Committee for Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So I'm just re-elected for my second term, which is always 4 years. Yeah. Well, the committee is let's say one of these treaty bodies which are extremely important because we monitor binding treaties, binding human rights treaties. And in that sense, we are one of the very few institutions in the UN system who have an independent monitoring role. We are accountability institutions for governments. Yeah? Even if you look at the Universal Periodic Review, the system of review which has been installed with the Human Rights Council, it's still something where the concludings at the end are formulated politically in the plenary. So that is a limitation, but it's also a very strong instrument. But all other formats which you find, maybe even the SDG monitoring in New York is a voluntary report on voluntary standards. And I think the structure or the importance of these treaty bodies is that they monitor binding treaties. And therefore, they are not always very much liked by states because we can really highlight what are problems they have in implementation, where there are loopholes in the implementation and realization. We can pinpoint to where groups are overseen, discriminated in their enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights. So I think it's a quite interesting role. Maybe I end by saying that this system of independent accountability institutions, the human rights treaty bodies, is not very well stuffed in the UN system. Yeah, the whole human rights system in the UN gets 3% of the overall budget of the UN. And in this 3%, treaty bodies gets very little. And we have a very slim secretariat. So the circumstances could be better, but we try to do the best out of it. And I think the committee colleagues are very engaged. We have 18 people from 18 different countries. Our committee has, among the 18 people, 6 or 7 women, which is among the treaty bodies quite a large number, but it shows also that there is more space for gender equality in these treaty bodies, in all the treaty bodies. Yeah. Committee is on a regular basis checking, when we do state reports, the situation of particularly vulnerable groups. So if a state report comes, it depends a bit from the situation of states, because vulnerable groups or particularly sensitive marginalized groups vary from state to state. If there is a civil war, if there are mountain or agricultural areas, if it's more industrialized. So many things are changing. So we have to focus on maybe the most relevant problems. But I think consistently we are asking questions, particularly on indigenous people, on, let's say, informal sector employment, informal sector income structures. So land issues are very often happening in these contexts, but it contacts also in the context of the right to housing, so shelter issues in slum areas, urban areas. But they are also relevant for, let's say, the right to self-determination for indigenous people. They are relevant for other rights in the covenant, like cultural rights, the right to health and water. It depends a bit, yeah. So we try to systematically ask states questions concerning covenant obligations related to land. And we believe that for the realization of several covenant rights, the enjoyment of security of tenure is extremely important. Yeah, so therefore we thought it would be good to develop this general comment, because then we have the time to describe also a bit what are the obligations from our, let's say, learnings while we do all the state reports, reviews, what we have learned, what is important to highlight, how important these are. Yeah. There are several. Maybe you live, let's take a modern example. You live in Mexico and there is a wind park to be built based by government planning and by international financing in order to reduce the CO2 emissions of your country. And you are living there because you belong to a farmers group who has lived there since decades or maybe centuries, but you don't have a formal title. Or maybe you have a title as a common village, yeah, ejido in Mexico. So it's not specified to you, or maybe it's not well documented in the state register. It can be easily happen that you are overseen, that you are not realized as landowners, yeah. And suddenly you might be faced by expropriation or maybe threats to leave the land. And then you are maybe losing your place where you live, your shelter, your right to housing, but you might also lose maybe the area you have planted with fruits or which were based on your income. The nuts and the goats were maybe contributing to 30% of the income of a very poor family. If these type of things are lost and you have no access rights or formally recognized titles on that you use this forest for your goat and for using fruits, these are all things easily overseen. Yeah, and this describes how closely linked are, let's say, the security of tenure, your right to be recognized in that sense for your maybe own income, for your own living, for your own livelihood. Yeah. Climate change has an impact on future use opportunities for land which is there. Yeah, there will be coastal areas, for example, which might be flooded or at least partially flooded every year, which will alterate maybe the potential for using it. They can become salty. They might be no longer possible for the use of agriculture because of regular floods. They might no longer be used for housing. So they might change usage of land which are currently done by people. Yeah, it might be then people who have a formal title to this. It might be people who have no title to this at all, but are using it in a similar way like the other group was using it. It might be that there are other forms of usage of these coastal areas, for example, by fisherfolk, which has access to this. Yeah. So if then the state reacts to this climate change, so the climate change itself has an impact on this, yeah, and you have to think about what is, for example, the role and the responsibilities of all those contributing to climate change, whether these people who are affected, who might have not contributed themselves substantively to climate change because their CO2 emissions are extremely tiny or small. Yeah, so you see already there's a link between, let's say, our own way of living, our style of living, how we adopt to climate change. We might mitigate climate change, reduce our CO2 emissions on day-to-day lives of people living in, I don't know, Bangladesh or the Philippines or Indonesia, or on one of the islands in the Pacific. Yeah. So what is the relationship between the two? And you can already see it's a dramatic impact on this. The second role we have then to see is that climate change policies itself might have a human rights impact or are not neutral. Yeah, you might then build a dam in Bangladesh, maybe to protect certain people living in areas which might be floodable on a regular scale. And it could be that maybe the hotel and the golf course will be perfectly dammed and safeguarded by adaptation measures, and the fisher village close by is not protected, yeah, or that the dam is built on land which might belong to people who have undocumented land titles, while others are protected, others might be not protected. It describes how sensitive it is that climate change itself will have impact on the use of land and maybe also the user rights of land, but also the climate change policies has something to do with who will be protected, how strong will be the impact of climate change. Yeah? If a state is a responsible state and takes care of maybe people being affected by climate change, the impact of climate change might be much lower on economic, social, cultural rights if the state is taking care of particularly those vulnerable groups. Yeah, and one of the fears I have sometimes is if climate change adaptation is going to happen, it will take care of all those who have assets, something to show it belongs to them. They might be compensated, they might get access to, let's say, form of escape or reparations, while all those who are already very weak, vulnerable, marginal, which don't have so many assets or not documented the assets they have, might even face more substantive problems. Yeah. And then we might have people who lose their home. You know, if you live on a Pacific island and the whole island has to migrate, what is your human rights title against anybody else? We have to take climate change very serious, and we have to find adequate human rights answers to deal with the problems of persons affected from climate change. I mentioned already climate change as a very important ingredient. Maybe I add maybe the recent assessments done in the UN system on biodiversity losses. There's also a panel like the panel on climate change, which is there on biodiversity. We have a dramatic loss of, let's say, habitability of certain areas worldwide on biodiversity, but also on maybe soil sanity and the sustainable possibility to use land resources. This is also linked to water availability, and bring this combined together is another, at least, challenge to survive livelihood rights. Yeah, and maybe this is an event I can mention. Yeah. Advice would be do what you find extremely interesting. Don't look for maybe what is recommended always. I studied first political science. Everybody said you will never get a job with political science. I was never unemployed because it was giving me the tools I want to do. Yeah, you can develop this. Yeah, I focused on economic, social, cultural rights, which is the least attractive area of human rights policies because it has been long neglected, and I think it's still an area which needs to be more investigated. It can be extremely interesting diving into this, and I would follow maybe your soul or your heart on the issues which matters to you, yeah, and look into these matters and find answers to this. I think this is particularly interesting. Then you are convinced yourself and you have the energy to study, investigate, be impatient with solutions offered to you, and maybe find out new solutions.